The morning was pale and cold, though it was May. Mist moved slowly across the river, soft and silent, as if the Thames itself were holding its breath. The towers rose from the water like stone memories, ancient, unmoving, indifferent to the footsteps that had passed through their gates for centuries. Ravens watched from the battlements. Somewhere beyond the walls, London was waking, but here, inside the fortress, time seemed to move differently, more slowly, as though each moment lingered before allowing itself to become the past. A small group had gathered in the courtyard. Not a crowd, not the roar of spectators or the restless noise of a festival, but a quiet assembly of witnesses. Soldiers stood in formation, their armor dull in the grey light. Ladies wrapped in dark cloaks pressed gloved hands together. Officials murmured softly to one another, their voices restrained, their eyes careful. They were waiting. At the center of the courtyard stood a scaffold, newly built, its wooden boards pale against the darker stone around it. Straw had been scattered across the platform. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and iron. It was not a large scaffold. This was not meant to be a spectacle for the masses. This was meant to be precise, controlled, contained. The tower had seen many endings. Kings, rebels, traitors, dreamers, all had walked these paths. Some had shouted, some had prayed, some had fainted before reaching the steps. The stones remembered everything and nothing at the same time. Footsteps approached. Soft at first, almost lost beneath the rustle of fabric and the quiet shifting of boots. Then clearer, steady, deliberate. A woman emerged from the doorway. She wore gray, the color of mist and morning. Her cloak moved gently around her ankles as she walked, and beneath it her steps were careful but unhurried. Her hair had been gathered beneath a cap, hiding the dark waves that had once drawn so many eyes. Around her neck was a small cross. She did not look toward the crowd immediately. Instead, she lifted her gaze toward the sky, as if searching for something beyond the walls, an answer, a memory, or simply the comfort of open space. No one spoke her name aloud. There was no need. Everyone present knew who she was. But if you had arrived at that moment without knowledge of the past, you might have wondered. Was she a murderer? A traitor? A queen? A victim? History rarely reveals itself all at once. It prefers to unfold slowly, like a curtain drawn back one careful inch at a time. The guards stepped aside, and she walked forward. 3 years earlier, she had entered these gates surrounded by celebration, banners of gold and crimson, the promise of a crown, the restless hope of a new future. She had come then as a rising star, the center of a king's attention, the woman for whom an entire kingdom had been reshaped. Now she returned as a prisoner. The same stones, the same walls. But everything had changed. A breeze moved through the courtyard, lifting the edges of her cloak. Somewhere nearby, a bell began to ring, slow, measured, each strike echoing through the air like a heartbeat. Some said she had enchanted the king. Some said she had bewitched him. Some whispered darker things, rumors that clung like shadows, refusing to disappear. They said she had too many fingers. They said she was cruel. They said she laughed too loudly. They said she had destroyed a marriage that God Himself had blessed. They said many things. Rumors have always moved faster than truth. She reached the steps of the scaffold and paused, only for a moment, before stepping forward again. One of the attendants offered a hand. She accepted it with a small nod, lifting her skirts slightly so they would not catch on the wood. The boards creaked beneath her weight, a quiet protest against the inevitability of what was about to happen. Above, the sky remained pale and distant. The witnesses watched closely, searching for signs, fear, defiance, regret, anything that might reveal who she truly was beneath the layers of accusation and legend. But faces at the edge of death are difficult to read. Somewhere behind the assembled crowd stood a man who had traveled far for this morning. His task required precision. Unlike the heavy axes used in England, he carried a sword, long, thin, sharp enough to end a life in a single movement. A gesture of mercy, some said. A gesture of control, others believed. She spoke quietly to the women beside her, her voice low enough that only fragments reached the listeners nearby. A faint smile appeared, unexpected, almost gentle, as though she were reassuring them instead of herself. Was it courage? Was it exhaustion? Or simply acceptance? The tower did not answer. History rarely answers immediately. It leaves questions suspended in the air, waiting for time to shape them into stories. She looked out over the courtyard at last. Not searching for someone specific, not for a familiar face or a final ally, but taking in the moment as a whole, as if she understood that this would be the last image she carried with her. Stone walls. Gray sky. Silent witnesses. The shape of a life narrowing toward a single point. If someone had asked her, years earlier, whether she imagined this ending, what would she have said? Perhaps she would have laughed. Perhaps she would have turned away. Because once she had been young, brilliant, alive with possibility. Once she had stood at court surrounded by music and silk and whispered admiration. Once a king had written letters to her filled with longing, promising everything. Once she had changed the course of a nation. And now she stood here. How does a woman travel such a distance? From fascination to fear, from triumph to condemnation, from queen to prisoner? What choices lead to such a morning? What desires begin a story that ends beneath a blade? The bells stopped ringing. Silence returned. She lowered herself slowly to her knees, the straw beneath her shifting softly. One of her ladies moved forward, hands trembling slightly as she prepared a cloth. The swordsman waited. The witnesses held their breath. And in that suspended moment, before steel met flesh, before history sealed itself, the story paused. To understand how she arrived here, we must step backward. Back through the years. Back before the accusations, before the crown, before the king's gaze found her. Back to a girl whose birth date is uncertain, whose beginnings seem to rise from fog like the morning mist over the river. Back to the beginning. She was born into uncertainty. The girl whose life would unfold into legend was called Anne Boleyn. Even the year of her birth remains a quiet mystery, blurred by missing records and conflicting accounts. Some say 1501. Others suggest several years later. The truth slips between dates like mist through open fingers. It is a strange beginning for a woman who would one day stand at the center of England's history, as if she arrived not with a clear announcement, but slowly, emerging from shadow. Perhaps this uncertainty feels fitting. Because from the very beginning, she belonged to a world where identity was shaped not only by birth, but by ambition, expectation, and the careful navigation of power. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a man who understood movement, social movement, political movement, the quiet art of rising without appearing to climb too quickly. He was intelligent, educated, fluent in languages, and skilled in diplomacy. At court, these qualities mattered more than brute strength or inherited wealth alone. He observed, listened, waited for opportunities, and when they appeared, he stepped forward with precision. He was not yet among the greatest nobles of England, but he stood close enough to power to see its workings from the inside. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, brought something different to the family. She belonged to one of the oldest and most respected aristocratic lineages in England. Through her, the children inherited bloodlines tied to centuries of noble history, a reminder that status could be both earned and inherited, both fragile and deeply rooted. Together, Thomas and Elizabeth created a household shaped by expectation. Children born into such families did not belong entirely to themselves. Their futures were quietly negotiated long before they understood the meaning of choice. Education, marriage, alliances, all were pieces in a larger design. The girl who would later captivate a king began her life far from the noise of royal attention, at Hever Castle in Kent. Hever was not the grandest residence in England, but it possessed a quiet beauty. Moats reflected changing skies. Gardens shifted with the seasons, green in spring, heavy with roses in summer, golden in autumn. Inside, stone corridors carried echoes of footsteps and whispered conversations. It was a place where a child could explore, learn, observe. And observation would become one of her greatest strengths. We know little about her earliest years, and what survives is filtered through later stories, colored by admiration or hostility depending on who told them. Some described her as lively, quick-witted, restless. Others claimed she was ambitious even as a child, though such descriptions often reveal more about the storyteller than the subject. What seems more certain is that she received an unusually strong education for a girl of her time. Languages, music, reading, religious instruction, these were not merely accomplishments meant to decorate a future marriage. They were tools. The Tudor court valued conversation as much as appearance, intellect as much as lineage. A young woman who could speak gracefully, write eloquently, and respond quickly to shifting social currents held a kind of invisible power. Her family understood this. England at the beginning of the 16th century was a place of careful transformation. The medieval world had not entirely disappeared, but new ideas moved quietly through Europe: humanism, scholarship, curiosity about art and philosophy. Courts became centers not only of politics but of culture. To succeed, one needed more than obedience. One needed adaptability. Perhaps this is why, while still very young, she was sent away. Not as a rejection, but as an investment. In 1513 or 1514, the exact date remains debated, she left England to serve abroad as part of a royal household. For a child, such a departure must have felt both thrilling and frightening. To leave familiar walls, familiar gardens, the rhythms of home, and step into a wider world filled with new languages and expectations. Her path would lead first to the court of the Netherlands, and soon after to France, a country whose elegance and refinement would shape her more deeply than anyone could have predicted. But before she crossed the sea, before silk gowns and foreign courts transformed her reputation, she was simply a daughter in a family watching the horizon. The Boleyn children were raised not only to survive at court, but to shine within it. And yet no one, not her parents, not her tutors, not even the girl herself, could have imagined how far that preparation would carry her, or how dangerous brilliance could become when it caught the attention of a king. The story moves now from quiet English fields to the glittering world of France, a place where she would learn to become someone entirely new. The journey across the sea marked the first true transformation of her life. England faded behind her, its familiar green landscapes, its quieter court, its more restrained traditions, replaced by movement, language, and the uncertain excitement of a foreign world. She was still young, still learning who she might become, but already she stood at the threshold of something larger than the life she had known at Hever Castle. At first, she joined the household of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, a court known for its discipline and intellectual atmosphere. Margaret herself was a formidable woman, politically astute, highly educated, accustomed to navigating the complex alliances of European power. Here, the young girl learned observation, how to stand quietly while absorbing everything, how to listen before speaking, how to understand that influence often moved beneath the surface rather than in loud declarations. But it was France that would shape her most deeply. In 1514, Princess Mary Tudor, sister of Henry VIII, traveled to France to marry King Louis XII, and the young English attendant accompanied her. The marriage was brief. The king died soon after, but the English girl remained, entering the service of Queen Claude, the new French queen and wife of Francis I. The French court was unlike anything she had seen. Where the English court could feel formal and restrained, France moved with elegance and fluidity. Music filled the halls. Poetry was recited as naturally as conversation. Fashion shifted constantly, delicate fabrics, daring cuts, subtle details designed to draw the eye. Courtiers danced, debated philosophy, composed verses, and practiced the art of charm with deliberate skill. Here, refinement was a language, and she learned it quickly. She absorbed French fluently, not as an academic exercise but as a living tool. She studied music and dance, reading and writing, religious thought and courtly manners. She learned how to move through a room so that people noticed without fully understanding why. She learned that silence could be as powerful as speech, that mystery could invite fascination. Some later observers would claim that she returned from France changed beyond recognition, no longer an English provincial girl, but a woman shaped by continental sophistication. There may be truth in this. France offered not only elegance, but exposure to new ideas. The Renaissance spirit lingered there, curiosity about art, literature, theology. Humanist thinkers questioned old assumptions, and women at court sometimes exercised influence in ways less visible but deeply felt. Queens and noblewomen hosted salons, shaped fashion, guided cultural trends. For a young woman watching closely, this world expanded the boundaries of possibility. She saw that femininity did not need to mean silence. Wit could attract attention. Intelligence could become an ornament as valuable as beauty. Yet life at court was never purely graceful. Beneath the surface existed rivalry, gossip, alliances formed and broken with quiet efficiency. Reputation mattered deeply, and a single whisper could alter a future. To survive required not only charm but awareness, the ability to read shifting moods and unspoken tensions. 7 years passed. 7 years of learning, watching, becoming. The girl who had left England grew into a young woman whose identity was no longer entirely English. She carried France with her, in her speech, her style, her confidence, even in the way she held her gaze. When she eventually returned to England, she did not arrive as the same person who had departed. She brought something unfamiliar with her, a subtle difference that others would sense before they understood. She moved with ease. She spoke with grace. She seemed shaped by a wider world. And in a court where novelty attracted attention, difference could be irresistible. No one yet knew how much attention she would command. No one yet knew that a king would soon begin to watch her, first with curiosity, then with fascination, and eventually with something far more dangerous. But before the king's gaze found her, another story unfolded, quieter, more personal, and perhaps more sincere. A story of first love. When Anne Boleyn returned to England in 1522, she carried France with her. It showed in the way she moved, graceful without effort, poised without stiffness. It sounded in her voice, touched by French cadence, softer and more fluid than the sharper tones of the English court. It appeared in her clothing, her taste for elegance, her quiet confidence. She did not arrive as a girl waiting to be noticed. She arrived already aware of how attention worked. The English court under Henry VIII was brilliant, but different from France. There was music and laughter, tournaments and feasts, but also a deeper undercurrent of competition. Every smile could carry meaning. Every glance might signal alliance or rivalry. Courtiers measured one another constantly, searching for weakness, advantage, or opportunity. And entered this world during a court masque, a performance filled with symbolism and spectacle. She danced, dressed in elaborate costume, moving among nobles and ambassadors beneath candlelight and music. For many, it was their first glimpse of her since childhood. She was not considered the greatest beauty of her time. Contemporary descriptions speak of dark eyes, expressive and alive, of a slender figure, of a presence that drew attention not through perfection but through energy. She seemed alert, aware, almost slightly amused by the world around her. And people noticed. Among those who watched her was a young nobleman named Henry Percy, heir to the powerful Earl of Northumberland. Percy belonged to one of England's most ancient families, raised with expectations as heavy as armor. Their meeting may have begun casually, shared conversations, laughter during court gatherings, small moments unnoticed by most. But something grew between them. It is difficult now to know exactly how deeply they felt, because history rarely preserves private emotions clearly. Yet enough traces remain to suggest that their attachment was real. They spent time together whenever possible. They spoke quietly. They understood one another in ways that felt separate from the noise of court life. In a world where marriages were arranged for advantage, affection could feel almost rebellious. At some point, they exchanged promises. Whether formal or informal, whether witnessed or whispered, their understanding carried meaning. Percy began to treat, and not merely as a companion but as someone he intended to marry. For a brief moment, it may have seemed that her future would follow a familiar path, a noble marriage, a respected position, a life shaped by duty but softened by personal feeling. But court life rarely allowed such simplicity. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the king's chief adviser and one of the most powerful men in England, intervened. The reasons remain debated. Some believed Wolsey acted because Percy's family had already arranged another match for him. Others suspected political considerations, alliances that mattered more than affection. Whatever the truth, the result was immediate. The relationship was ended. Percy was ordered to withdraw. The understanding between them was dismissed as youthful foolishness, and found herself abruptly separated from a future she may have begun to imagine as her own. Such endings leave quiet marks. Later accounts suggest she never forgave Wolsey for this interference. Whether this resentment burned constantly or simply lingered as a memory, it formed one of the early threads connecting personal emotion with political consequence. Loss changes how a person moves through the world. After Percy, Anne appeared more guarded. She laughed, she danced, she participated fully in court life, but something in her approach shifted. Perhaps she learned that affection alone could not protect against power. Perhaps she realized that choices were rarely hers alone to make. And yet she did not withdraw. Instead, she became more noticeable. Her wit sharpened. Her conversation gained depth. She developed a reputation for intelligence, for quick responses, for a refusal to flatter blindly. Some admired her boldness. Others found it unsettling. The English court had many beautiful women. Few possessed mystery. Few seemed capable of holding attention without offering immediate accessibility. And understood, consciously or instinctively, that distance could create fascination. She was warm enough to invite interest, but reserved enough to remain slightly unreachable. And somewhere among the observers of court life, a king began to notice her. At first, perhaps only as one presence among many. A lady-in-waiting who spoke French elegantly. A woman whose laughter sounded different from the others. A figure moving through candlelight with quiet self-possession. But attention, once given by a king, rarely remains small. Henry VIII was nearing his mid-30s, still charismatic, still powerful, yet already shadowed by one persistent anxiety. He had no legitimate male heir. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had produced only one surviving child, a daughter. The future of the Tudor dynasty felt uncertain. And uncertainty makes people look for change. When the king's gaze returned again and again to Anne Boleyn, something began that neither of them could yet fully understand. A story not of sudden passion, but of slow escalation. Of letters written in secret. Of desire growing alongside ambition. Of a choice she would make, a refusal that would alter everything. Because when the king finally approached her not as a distant observer but as a man accustomed to being obeyed, and would do something no one expected, she would say no. By the year 1526, the rhythm of court life had settled into something both brilliant and predictable. Feasts illuminated by candlelight, long hunts through forests that echoed with horns, quiet diplomatic conversations hidden beneath laughter and music. Henry VIII still embodied the image of a Renaissance king, athletic, charismatic, confident in his authority. Yet beneath this image lay a growing restlessness that few could fully see. He was 35 years old, and although his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had endured for nearly 2 decades, it had failed to produce the one thing England expected from its king, a legitimate male heir. Their daughter Mary lived, but the absence of a son created a silent anxiety that followed Henry everywhere, shaping his thoughts even when he appeared most at ease. It was during this time of uncertainty that Anne Boleyn's presence began to draw his attention more firmly. At first she may have seemed simply refreshing, a lady-in-waiting who spoke with intelligence, whose manner carried traces of France, whose responses were thoughtful rather than automatically agreeable. She did not overwhelm with conventional beauty. Instead, she created interest through movement, expression, and a quick, observant mind. She listened carefully and answered with wit that felt lively without being cruel. For a king accustomed to admiration, her subtle resistance may have felt like discovery, and did not behave like many other women at court. Her style reflected continental influence, refined, elegant, slightly unconventional in ways that felt modern rather than rebellious. She read, discussed religious ideas, and participated in conversations that moved beyond surface-level charm. This combination of intelligence and distance gave her an aura of mystery. She was present, yet not entirely available, warm, yet never fully yielding. Henry began to notice these differences. Small moments accumulated: a shared dance, a conversation during a hunt, a remark that lingered longer than expected. Gradually, curiosity turned into fascination. The king had experienced affection before, including a brief relationship with Anne's sister Mary Boleyn, but Anne herself responded differently to attention. Where others might have accepted the predictable role of royal mistress, she hesitated, allowing closeness while maintaining a careful boundary. Letters soon followed. Some survive today, revealing a voice both passionate and impatient. "I wish to be in your arms, my mistress," Henry wrote, "for I have been struck by the dart of love, which wounds beyond all measure." The intensity of his language shows not only desire but also urgency, the voice of a man unused to refusal, increasingly captivated by what he could not easily possess. At court, whispers grew. Observers noticed how often Henry sought her presence, how conversations extended beyond formality, how gifts appeared discreetly. Ambassadors reported the change in tone. Ladies watched with curiosity or concern. Everyone understood that royal attention could reshape destinies, but few could predict where this particular attachment might lead. Anne herself understood the weight of what was happening. The favor of a king offered power and danger in equal measure. To accept his affection meant stepping into a space where personal choices could carry national consequences. Perhaps she remembered her earlier attachment to Henry Percy, and the way it had been ended by forces beyond her control. Perhaps she had learned that surrendering too quickly often meant losing influence. Whatever her reasoning, she chose caution. She allowed admiration but resisted possession. Each refusal created tension, deepening the king's fascination rather than diminishing it. What remained just out of reach became more valuable. Henry's attention intensified, shifting from curiosity to something closer to obsession, as he began to imagine a future shaped around her presence. The court watched as a subtle transformation unfolded, a dance between power and restraint, desire and strategy. And did not follow the expected path, and this deviation created momentum that neither she nor the king could fully control. When the moment came for her to define the boundaries of their relationship, she would make a decision that seemed almost unimaginable. She would refuse to become his mistress. And with that refusal, everything would begin to change. In a court governed by hierarchy and expectation, refusal was a rare language, especially when addressed to a king. Yet Anne Boleyn understood that acceptance carried its own dangers. To become Henry's mistress would bring temporary influence, but history had shown how quickly royal favor could fade once desire cooled. She had watched others rise and disappear. She had seen how proximity to power could elevate and erase in the same motion. Whether through instinct, calculation, or a combination of both, she chose a path that few women would have dared to consider, and did not reject Henry with harshness. Instead, she created distance that felt deliberate yet gentle, allowing affection to grow without granting him what he sought most. She encouraged conversation, accepted letters, participated in the slow development of intimacy, but she refused the role expected of her. If he wanted her, she implied, he would need to offer something more permanent, more meaningful, something that transformed her position entirely. For Henry, this resistance intensified desire. He wrote more frequently, his letters revealing longing and frustration intertwined. He spoke of devotion, of the pain of separation, of the wish to be close to her beyond the constraints of court etiquette. What began as fascination deepened into determination. The more she withheld, the more he pursued. Time passed in a delicate tension. Courtiers watched carefully, unsure whether they were witnessing a passing romance or the beginning of something more significant. Anne's behavior puzzled some and impressed others. She appeared neither submissive nor reckless, but controlled, aware of her influence yet unwilling to surrender it too easily. Gradually, a new idea began to take shape in Henry's mind. If Anne refused to become his mistress, perhaps she could become something else. The possibility may have seemed distant at first, almost unthinkable. He was already married to Catherine of Aragon, a queen respected across Europe. Yet Henry's anxiety about succession remained constant, and over time personal desire began to merge with political reasoning. He convinced himself that his marriage had never been fully legitimate in the eyes of God. Catherine had previously been married to his brother Arthur, and although papal dispensation had allowed Henry to marry her, doubts lingered. Biblical interpretations offered justification for questioning the union. What may have begun as emotional rationalization slowly transformed into a theological argument. And did not create this belief alone, but her presence gave it urgency. What began as a personal relationship was becoming a national crisis. Anne, whether willingly or not, stood at its center. The question of Henry's marriage soon became known as the King's Great Matter, a phrase that sounded almost gentle compared to the turmoil it created. At its heart lay a simple request. Henry wanted his marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled so that he could marry again. Yet simplicity vanished as soon as the request reached Rome. Catherine refused to accept the dissolution of her marriage. She believed deeply in its legitimacy, and in her role as queen. Supported by powerful allies, including her nephew Emperor Charles V, she resisted quietly but firmly. What followed was not a single decision but years of delay, investigations, hearings, diplomatic pressure, and theological debates that moved slowly through layers of authority. And waited. Waiting became the defining rhythm of her life during these years. She remained close to Henry, receiving his attention, yet unable to step fully into the role he envisioned for her. Court gossip intensified, dividing opinion sharply. Some viewed her as a symbol of change and possibility. Others saw her as a disruptive force threatening established order. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Henry's chief minister, attempted to secure the annulment through negotiation with the Pope. He believed diplomacy could resolve the matter, but international politics complicated everything. Rome hesitated, unwilling to anger Catherine's powerful relatives. Each delay increased Henry's frustration. When Wolsey failed to deliver the desired outcome, his position weakened rapidly. Once one of the most powerful figures in England, he fell from favor, accused of failing the king. Anne's earlier resentment toward him, rooted partly in the ending of her relationship with Henry Percy, added personal layers to a political downfall that reshaped the balance of power at court. In Wolsey's place rose new figures, most notably Thomas Cromwell, whose pragmatic approach to governance would transform England's relationship with the Church. Cromwell recognized that if Rome refused to grant Henry what he wanted, England might need to redefine its own authority. The implications were immense. Gradually, Henry began to separate himself from papal control, asserting the idea that the English crown held spiritual as well as political power within its own realm. Laws were introduced that reduced the influence of Rome, shifting loyalty toward the king as supreme authority. Religious and political boundaries blurred, creating uncertainty that touched every level of society. Throughout this upheaval, Anne's position remained complex. She influenced Henry's thinking in subtle ways, encouraging interest in reformist ideas and supporting scholars who questioned traditional structures. Yet she also lived within constant scrutiny. Every delay meant more whispers, more doubt, more tension between expectation and reality. Years passed, and the cost of waiting grew heavier. Youth slipped quietly away, replaced by urgency. The promise of becoming queen existed alongside the possibility of sudden failure. To remain suspended between roles required strength that few could see from the outside. The king's great matter was no longer simply about love or desire. It had become a turning point for an entire nation, reshaping its religious identity and political future. And at the center of it stood Anne, patient, watched, and increasingly inseparable from the destiny Henry believed awaited him. On January 25, 1533, Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII were married in secret. The ceremony was simple, almost austere compared to the splendor that would follow at her coronation, yet it carried immense significance. Anne was already pregnant, a fact that added both urgency and tension to the union. There were no grand crowds, no cheering throngs. Only a handful of witnesses, the quiet exchange of vows, and the private acknowledgement that their lives had shifted irrevocably. For Anne, it was a moment of triumph and vulnerability intertwined. Triumph because her patience and restraint had finally yielded the title she sought, vulnerability because the public had yet to accept her position. The court was not yet ready, the people not yet persuaded, and the shadow of Catherine of Aragon still loomed over every action and conversation. This hidden ceremony was both a declaration and a secret, an assertion of agency in a world that often left little room for it. The days following the marriage were filled with cautious optimism. Letters were written and messages sent to trusted advisers. Anne allowed herself moments of hope and quiet celebration, yet she knew that each smile, each whispered conversation, carried weight far beyond personal joy. Political maneuvering continued behind the scenes. Supporters rallied discreetly while opponents whispered doubts and predictions of disaster. Every action, every word, was examined and interpreted, magnified by the delicate balance between secrecy and the inevitability of revelation. And had crossed the threshold. She had chosen agency over submission, and now she had to navigate a world that could punish her for the very courage that defined her. On June 1, 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned queen at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was grand, a tapestry of gold, silk, and ritual, designed to assert her authority and legitimacy. The abbey filled with the hum of voices, the echo of ceremonial steps, the subtle movement of courtiers balancing admiration with caution. Anne walked beneath the canopy, her posture poised and steady, every gesture measured to convey dignity. Yet despite the pageantry, the city outside did not greet her with the warmth she might have hoped for. The people's loyalty remained with Catherine of Aragon. Whispers of scandal lingered in the streets, and many saw Anne as a usurper, a foreign-influenced interloper whose rise had come at the expense of the long-reigning queen. Even within the walls of the abbey, tension was tangible. The elaborate robes and glittering crown contrasted with the quiet murmurs of uncertainty. Nobles who had once courted her favor now watched with suspicion, wondering how she would wield her influence. And moved with awareness, understanding that every step forward was a negotiation with history itself. Each smile, each acknowledgement of a dignitary, was a careful exercise of power and diplomacy. In those hours, she was both triumphant and isolated, celebrated and scrutinized, stepping fully into a role she had long envisioned yet had never experienced in its totality. The coronation marked the beginning of her public reign, a moment of visible authority that also carried invisible pressures. Her every action would be interpreted, her every word remembered. The ceremonies and rituals of that day were more than spectacle. They were the framework within which her story would continue to unfold, a reminder that power, even when achieved, was never entirely secure. And had attained her goal, yet the path ahead remained uncertain, the shadow of expectation long, and the weight of a king's desire heavy upon her shoulders. On September 7, 1533, Anne Boleyn gave birth to a daughter. The child was named Elizabeth, a name that would one day resonate through history. In the palace, the moment was filled with relief and quiet celebration. Anne had carried her pregnancy through the uncertain tension of court life, under constant scrutiny, and emerged with a living heir, even if not the son Henry had longed for. The king had secretly hoped for a boy, and his disappointment, though veiled in public decorum, was real, and understood the subtle weight of this disappointment. A daughter would not secure the dynasty as Henry desired. Yet, she also recognized the significance of what had been accomplished. A child, living, breathing, a continuation of her own bloodline, was a victory in its own right. She sent letters announcing the birth, carefully phrased to balance truth and expectation. To courtiers and allies, she framed Elizabeth as a miracle, a sign of hope. Yet she knew the truth could not be hidden for long. Elizabeth's arrival shifted the court subtly. The tension between what Henry wanted and what fate had delivered became more pronounced. Anne, resilient and attentive, began to prepare herself for the years to come, for the struggle to maintain her position, for the delicate diplomacy of motherhood, for the constant gaze of a king who could be pleased one moment and unsettled the next. Even joy carried with it caution, even celebration was measured, aware of the fragile threads upon which her fortune rested. The years that followed, from 1534 to 1535, were filled with quiet tension and relentless pressure. Anne Boleyn, now queen, sought to solidify her influence and protect her position, but the ground beneath her often felt unstable. Multiple miscarriages haunted her reign, each loss a reminder of the precariousness of her favor and the king's unyielding desire for a male heir. At court, enemies circled discreetly. Jane Seymour and other ladies gained attention and subtly tested the boundaries of Henry's interest. Every smile, every whispered conversation, every glance became a potential weapon in the intricate politics of the court. Anne, intelligent and observant, responded with sharpness and precision. She was no longer the girl who had waited patiently. She had learned to assert herself, to speak her mind, to defend her position. Yet even this strength could be used against her. Words and actions interpreted unfavorably could fuel gossip, embolden adversaries, and erode her standing with the king. The tension weighed heavily on her. She became more cautious, yet there were moments when her temper surfaced, moments when she spoke too sharply, laughed too freely, or acted in ways that revealed her human vulnerability. Courtiers took note, recording behaviors that could later be turned into evidence of instability or impropriety. Each day demanded careful navigation, a balance of dignity and survival, of public persona and private resilience. During these years, Anne's character was forged in the crucible of expectation. Her intellect, her poise, and her ability to maintain composure under relentless scrutiny became her shield. Yet the question that haunted her, the question of succession, of legacy, of whether her position could endure, remained ever present, shadowing her triumphs with the weight of uncertainty. The palace, once a place of celebration, had become a terrain of subtle strategy, where power and desire collided, and where every moment could tip toward fortune or ruin. And had reached the apex of visibility, yet with that visibility came exposure to envy, intrigue, and the harsh reality that even a queen could never fully control her own destiny. In January 1536, Anne Boleyn discovered she was pregnant once again. The news arrived on a day already heavy with significance. Catherine of Aragon, the former queen, had just passed away. Rumors and whispers swirled immediately, some suggesting Anne had hastened Catherine's death, accusations entirely false, yet impossible to ignore. The court, ever hungry for scandal, embraced the tales with quiet fascination, giving each shadowed corridor and candlelit chamber new meaning. Anne's pregnancy brought both hope and dread. A living son could finally secure her position, quell whispers of disfavor, and satisfy the king's urgent desire for a male heir. She and Henry allowed themselves private optimism, planning for the future even as the court observed every nuance of behavior, ready to interpret the subtlest movement as sign or omen. Yet tragedy struck before hope could be fulfilled. The child, a boy, was stillborn. The grief was profound, silent, and shared only in private chambers. The loss reshaped everything. Henry's disappointment was palpable. Anne's despair, though quieter, ran deep. Their relationship, already delicate, already bound by expectation and desire, began to fray. Conversations that had once been warm grew tense. Moments of closeness now carried unspoken shadows. The dream of securing her position through childbirth had vanished, leaving uncertainty and fear in its place. Court gossip erupted with renewed intensity. Jane Seymour's presence became more noticeable, her beauty and composure highlighted against Anne's fragility. Courtiers whispered that the king's affections might shift. Every gesture, every glance, every casual remark became evidence in the silent trial that played out within the palace walls. Anne found herself both a participant in and a victim of a game she had never fully chosen, where survival required wit, restraint, and an unbroken exterior even when the heart faltered. The final pregnancy marked a turning point. It was a reminder that no title, no crown, could guarantee security. Even queens, exalted above most of humanity, were vulnerable to fate, rumor, and the fragile whims of those whose favor determined life or death. And Boleyn, poised and aware, now stood on the edge of a precipice, facing forces that could not be controlled, surrounded by enemies she could barely name, and yet compelled to maintain dignity, courage, and presence in the face of uncertainty that would soon become absolute. By April 1536, the wheels of intrigue were turning with ruthless precision. Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's shrewd chief minister, began orchestrating a series of events that would seal Anne Boleyn's fate. Her enemies, both at court and beyond, moved quietly but effectively, exploiting moments of misstep, whispers of scandal, and her natural human vulnerabilities. Musician Mark Smeaton was accused first, his confessions, coerced through fear and torture, forming the foundation of charges that would soon be extended to the Queen herself. One by one, those close to Anne were implicated. Her brother George, once a symbol of familial strength, was ensnared. Other courtiers were drawn into the web. Each arrest, each rumor, tightened the noose around her. The palace that had once been a stage for triumph became a theater of dread. Courtiers whispered in corners, servants exchanged uneasy glances, and every door she passed held the shadow of potential betrayal. The careful balance she had maintained through intelligence and charm now seemed fragile, as though the very patience that had elevated her had become the instrument of her undoing. Anne herself felt the shifting currents, aware of the trap closing around her. In the midst of power and visibility, she was suddenly isolated. Supporters watched silently, unwilling to risk themselves, while adversaries found courage in the momentum of accusation. The world she had navigated with poise and precision now moved independently of her will. The fall was not abrupt, it was methodical, calculated, and inescapable. On May 2, 1536, during the quiet of a midday meal, Anne Boleyn was arrested. Courtiers reported the scene with hushed astonishment. Guards entered, their presence rigid and unquestionable, and led her from the familiar chambers she had inhabited for years. She passed through gates she had once walked beneath as queen, crowned and celebrated, now entering through what would later be called the Gate of Traitors. The journey to the Tower was filled with a surreal quiet, and moved with calm composure, aware of every eye that observed her and every whisper that followed. There was no outburst, no desperate plea, only a measured acceptance of what was unfolding. The city streets, which had once watched her progress beneath banners and cheers, now looked on with tense curiosity and silent judgment. Inside the tower, the atmosphere was dense with anticipation and dread. The rooms that had witnessed triumph now held echoes of suspicion and fear. And understood, in a clarity born of experience and intelligence, that the game had changed irrevocably. No longer the orchestrator of events, she became subject to forces beyond her control. Yet even in this moment she carried herself with dignity, aware that how she met this first step into confinement would shape the narrative of her final days. By May 1536, Anne Boleyn found herself confined within the stone walls of the Tower of London, the same walls she had once walked beneath as a queen beneath banners and applause. Now, the grandeur of her past life was replaced by cold chambers, narrow windows, and the ever-present awareness of surveillance. The Tower was both prison and stage, a place where whispers echoed louder than voices, and where even silence carried accusation. Days stretched slowly. Anne received letters, some from allies, others from Henry himself, whose emotions were unpredictable, alternating between anger, longing, and detachment. Rumors coursed through the corridors like shadows, each more distorted than the last. That she had poisoned Catherine of Aragon, that she had consorted with men of low station, that she had betrayed her own family. None of it was true, yet in the atmosphere of fear and suspicion, truth mattered little. Anne's responses were measured, deliberate. She wrote letters that displayed calm reason, letters that pleaded subtly, defended her innocence, and, in some cases, sought to preserve her legacy. One such letter, often cited though its authenticity is debated, addressed Henry directly. If you find that I have ever in thought or deed failed in my duty to you, then let me be punished. But if not, then let me not be condemned without cause. Her words reflected both courage and an understanding of the precarious power dynamics she faced. Those around her observed shifts in mood, noting how Anne alternated between composure and quiet sorrow. At times she laughed, almost as if defying the gravity of her surroundings. At others, she wept in private, allowing grief and fear to surface where no eyes could witness. The Tower amplified every emotion, every thought, every trace of humanity, yet it could not fully strip her of self-possession. In this liminal space, Anne awaited the inevitable trial. Days passed slowly, measured by the sounds of footsteps in the corridors, the delivery of messages, the distant murmur of the city beyond the walls. She remained keenly aware that her every action and gesture was observed, that perception could be as fatal as reality. And yet, in the quiet chambers of the Tower, she preserved what no imprisonment could take, her dignity, her intelligence, and the quiet assertion that she would meet whatever came next with awareness and courage. On May 15, 1536, Anne Boleyn faced her trial within the walls of the Tower. The room was heavy with anticipation, the air thick with the weight of accusation and expectation. She stood before the court, composed yet acutely aware of the gravity surrounding her. The charges were shocking in their audacity: adultery with 5 men, incest with her own brother, and conspiracy to murder the king. Each allegation was improbable, rooted in rumor, ambition, and the careful orchestration of her enemies, yet in that moment, improbability mattered little. The judge presiding was her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, a man whose loyalties were divided between family and king. The courtroom was a paradox, familiar in its formalities yet alien in its implications. Courtiers and witnesses filed in, some reluctant, some eager. Among the jurors was Henry Percy, the man she had loved in her youth, now positioned to judge her. The irony was not lost, though neither words nor glances could alter the unfolding events. Testimony unfolded in a manner that blurred truth and invention. Men accused of illicit relations with the Queen confessed under pressure, their statements manipulated to fit the narrative of betrayal. Each name, each whispered insinuation, built toward a verdict that seemed predetermined. Anne, ever intelligent and perceptive, followed each detail, noting inconsistencies, recognizing motives, understanding that the law itself had been bent to serve ambition and fear. Throughout the proceedings, she maintained a careful balance. Her voice was steady, her demeanor composed. She did not lash out, she did not beg. Instead, she relied on reason, on her presence, on the quiet assertion of innocence that could not be silenced even when falsehoods filled the room. The court watched, some in admiration, others in disbelief, as she met accusation with dignity. When the verdict was announced, the weight of inevitability settled over her. Guilty. The words were brief, precise, and final. There was no room for appeal, no recourse left to her. The charges, absurd and constructed, were sufficient to seal her fate. And, poised and unbroken in appearance, absorbed the pronouncement with an understanding of the forces arrayed against her, knowing that from this moment forward, her destiny was no longer her own, but controlled by the king, the law, and the machinery of power that had long awaited this outcome. Between May 17th and 18th, 1536, Anne Boleyn prepared for the end that loomed with unrelenting certainty. The Tower, which had already confined her body and shadowed her movements, now became the space in which she confronted mortality. She attended to her final spiritual duties, partaking in prayers and communion with a calm composure that belied the storm of emotions within. She spoke to those around her with care and thoughtfulness, offering guidance, comfort, and small reassurances to her ladies-in-waiting. Her words were measured, reflecting both clarity of mind and the awareness that any action, any utterance, could become part of the story recorded for history. She affirmed her innocence quietly, consistently, and without bitterness. "I am not a heretic, a harlot, or a traitor, and never have been," she declared in private moments, seeking to leave behind a record of her truth. And arranged practical matters, attending to letters, possessions, and the well-being of those she loved. She wrote messages intended for the king, imploring fairness and appealing subtly to memory and duty, though aware that her words might never reach him or be read with compassion. She maintained a composure that was almost ritualistic, a deliberate act of preservation in the face of an irrevocable conclusion. Emotion, however, was never absent. In quiet moments she wept softly, mourning not only her own fate but the life she had envisioned, a life as queen, as mother, as woman unrestrained by the precarious limits imposed by power and politics. She reflected on Elizabeth, her daughter, whose early years would be marked by the consequences of courtly intrigue, yet whose future might one day shine as a testament to hope and resilience. Even as the shadow of execution approached, Anne's dignity remained unbroken. She moved through her final hours with an awareness that her story would outlast the immediate moment, that history would remember the courage of a woman who had faced falsehood, betrayal, and death with intelligence, poise, and an unwavering assertion of self. In these last days she embodied a quiet defiance, a refusal to surrender to fear, and a serene acknowledgment that the end was both inevitable and imminent. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn ascended the scaffold that awaited her in the Tower of London. The air was cold, carrying the faint mist of early dawn, and the crowd that had gathered was hushed, uncertain how to receive the queen who had once walked among them in gold and silk. She wore a grey gown, her hair carefully hidden beneath a cap, the simplicity of her attire contrasting with the grandeur of her former position. Every movement was deliberate, every step conveyed composure and awareness. Anne spoke briefly to those present, her voice calm and measured. She did not accuse the king, nor did she rail against the court that had condemned her. Instead, she asked for prayers, for herself and for the souls of those who had judged her. Her words were concise yet filled with dignity, a final assertion of agency in a moment where all external power had been stripped away. She knelt on the straw, placing her hands quietly in her lap, and committed herself to her faith. The executioner, a man brought from France as an act of mercy by Henry, waited. His blade, a long sword rather than the heavier axe typically used, promised a swifter death. Anne's composure never faltered. She adjusted her position carefully, bowed her head in a final act of submission to the inevitable, and murmured a prayer. The sword caught the morning light in a brief glint, and then silence. In that instant, centuries would remember both the method and the manner of her passing. One clean stroke ended the life of a woman who had dared to navigate the dangerous waters of power with intelligence, wit, and courage. The grey morning seemed to absorb the act, the mist carrying away the echoes of the crowd and leaving only the quiet acknowledgement of a life concluded, a story paused but not forgotten. After her execution, Anne Boleyn was laid to rest in a small, unmarked grave within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, inside the Tower of London. Her body, removed quietly from the scaffold, was placed in a simple wooden box, its edges worn and plain, with no stone to mark her resting place and no name to preserve her identity. The air was still, the chapel dim, and the only witnesses were a handful of attendants who carried out the solemn task with care and discretion. There was no ceremony of pomp or grandeur. The Queen, who had once paraded beneath banners, whose coronation had glittered with gold and silk, now rested in silence, her presence reduced to absence, her life acknowledged only by the memory of those who had served her. The walls of the chapel absorbed the quiet. The stone echoed faintly with the weight of history, as though the space itself bore witness to the loss of a woman whose life had intersected with power, ambition, and desire. Time moved on outside the chapel. London continued with its routines, the court returned to politics, and the streets murmured with gossip and speculation. Yet within the tower, in that small, shadowed corner, Anne's body lay still. Though nameless and unmarked, her presence lingered in the memory of her letters, her decisions, and the quiet dignity she had maintained until the final moment. The stillness of the grave became a silent testament, a space where history held its breath, remembering both what was lost and what endured beyond the immediate reckoning of power. Elizabeth was only 2 years old when her mother died. Declared illegitimate, removed from the line of succession, and raised under careful scrutiny, she grew up in a world shaped by the consequences of Anne Boleyn's life and death. The child's early years were marked by absence, the absence of a mother, the absence of security, the absence of certainty in a court that had already witnessed too much intrigue and cruelty. Yet even in that void, the influence of Anne persisted. The lessons of intelligence, resilience, and quiet assertion, though filtered through absence, remained embedded in Elizabeth's lineage and memory. She would grow into a woman whose own reign, 22 years later, would reflect the complexities of power, the necessity of strategic thinking, and the courage to navigate a world that had not always been kind to those who dared to assert themselves. And Boleyn never lived to see Elizabeth crowned, never witnessed the triumphs or the trials of the daughter who carried forward her bloodline. And yet, through Elizabeth, her presence endured, a silent, indelible mark on history. The story of the woman who refused to be merely a mistress, who demanded recognition, who faced the full weight of power and consequence with dignity, lived on in the life of her child. Without Anne, Elizabeth would not have been the queen she became. And so, the question remains echoing through time: who was this woman, really? A queen, a mother, a daughter, or a symbol of defiance and resilience? Perhaps all of these, and yet more, a presence that could not be contained, even by death itself.